Which, you should have never come, my daughter-in-law shouted across the restaurant as my dinner plate shattered against the marble floor beside my chair. Every conversation around us stopped. Forks froze halfway to mouths. A waiter standing near the wine display turned so quickly he nearly dropped a tray of glasses. And my son, Ryan, just sat there staring down at his steak like none of it had anything to do with him. I didn't cry. I didn't yell back. I simply looked at the mashed potatoes sliding slowly across the polished floor and realized something cold and painful. My family had stopped seeing me as a person a long time ago. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and tell me where you're watching from, because sometimes the only thing keeping us standing is knowing somebody out there understands. The evening had started with hope, which now felt embarrassing to admit. Sophie had turned 16 that week, and Ryan told me she wanted a quiet family dinner at Bellamy's, one of those expensive steakhouses outside Hartford where the lighting is soft and the napkins feel too heavy to unfold. I spent nearly 2 hours getting ready that evening. At 70 years old, small outings had started to feel important to me. Meaningful. I curled my silver hair carefully, wore pearl earrings my late husband Charles bought me on our 30th anniversary, and even sprayed the last little bit of my favorite perfume onto my wrists. I remember standing in front of my bedroom mirror, thinking maybe this dinner would feel normal again. Maybe Ryan would finally talk to me without looking over his shoulder at Vanessa first. Maybe Sophie would laugh the way she used to before everything became tense and careful around me. The drive to the restaurant took 40 minutes. Rain streaked softly against the windshield while old jazz music played through my car speakers. By the time I arrived, Bellamy's parking lot was already full. Expensive SUVs lined the front entrance, their headlights reflecting against the wet pavement. Inside, the restaurant smelled like butter, grilled steak, and expensive wine. Families leaned close together in curved leather booths while soft piano music drifted through hidden speakers overhead. I spotted Ryan immediately near the back dining room. Vanessa was beside him wearing a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than my monthly electric bill. Sophie sat across from them scrolling quietly on her phone. For a brief moment, my heart lifted when Sophie smiled and stood up to hug me. "Grandma, you look pretty," she whispered. That one sentence almost made the entire evening worth it. Almost. Vanessa barely glanced at me when I sat down. "You're late," she said while adjusting her napkin. I looked at the clock on the wall. I was exactly 3 minutes behind schedule. Traffic was awful near the interstate. I explained gently. "Well," Vanessa replied, lifting her wine glass, "some people know how to plan ahead." Ryan gave a weak chuckle under his breath without looking at me. I pretended not to notice. That had become a habit over the last few years. Pretending not to notice. Pretending not to hear the comments. Pretending not to see the looks Vanessa gave whenever I spoke too long or asked too many questions. Dinner moved awkwardly from there. Every topic seemed carefully designed to remind me how little space I occupied in their lives now. Vanessa talked about a luxury spa weekend in Vermont. Ryan discussed investment properties with a couple seated nearby whom he apparently knew from work. Sophie stayed mostly quiet, though every now and then I'd catch her looking at me with something that resembled guilt. When the waiter finally brought our meals, I tried one last time to reconnect with my son. "Ryan," I said softly, "I found some old fishing photos of you and your father last week. You should stop by sometime and take a look at them." Before Ryan could answer, Vanessa laughed sharply. "Oh my God, Eleanor, not tonight." The table went silent. I blinked in confusion. "I was only saying, you always do this," Vanessa interrupted. "Every dinner turns into some depressing trip down memory lane. Nobody wants to spend the evening hearing about old photo albums and dead people." My face grew warm instantly. Sophie lowered her eyes toward the tablecloth. Ryan still said nothing. I reached slowly for my water glass, trying to steady my hands. "I didn't mean to upset anyone," I whispered. Vanessa leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. "Honestly, this was supposed to be Sophie's night. But somehow you always manage to make everything about yourself." I stared at my untouched plate. The roasted chicken suddenly smelled like cardboard. Around us, laughter and silverware continued clinking through the restaurant, but our table felt sealed inside something heavy and airless. Then I quietly said the one thing that seemed to push Vanessa over the edge. "I just miss being part of this family." Vanessa's expression twisted instantly. Before I could even process what was happening, she grabbed the edge of my plate and shoved it off the table. The crash echoed through the entire dining room. "Which?" she snapped loudly. "You should have never come." The room fell completely silent. And in that terrible silence, my son looked away from me. Nobody moved for several seconds after the plate hit the floor. The sound seemed to hang inside the restaurant long after the porcelain stopped sliding across the marble tiles. I could feel dozens of strangers staring at me, waiting to see what the old woman would do next. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked embarrassed for me. A young waitress near the kitchen entrance pressed her lips together like she wanted to say something, but knew better. I slowly reached for my purse beside my chair and stood up carefully. My knees felt weak, though I refused to let anyone see it. "Eleanor," Ryan finally muttered under his breath, but he still would not look directly at me. Vanessa folded her arms tightly across her chest, like she was daring someone to challenge her. "You are ruining Sophie's birthday," she said coldly. Sophie looked horrified now. "Mom, stop," she whispered. But Vanessa ignored her completely. I pulled my coat over my shoulders while trying not to notice the pieces of roasted chicken and broken china scattered near my shoes. The smell of gravy clung to my sweater. "I think I should go," I said quietly. My voice sounded strange to me. Thin. Tired. Ryan rubbed his forehead like the entire situation had become inconvenient. "For him. Maybe that is for the best tonight," he said softly. That hurt more than Vanessa's outburst. Not because he agreed with her, but because he sounded relieved. I nodded once and walked toward the front entrance alone. Nobody followed me. Nobody apologized. The hostess near the door gave me a look filled with pity that made my chest ache worse than the humiliation itself. Outside, the rain had become heavier. Cold drops soaked through my coat almost immediately as I crossed the parking lot toward my old Buick. My hands shook while unlocking the door. For a few moments, I simply sat behind the steering wheel listening to rain strike the windshield in uneven rhythms. I kept seeing Ryan looking away from me. Not angry, not conflicted, just distant, like a man watching somebody else's problem unfold. I drove home slowly through the wet Connecticut streets while memories kept surfacing whether I wanted them to or not. Ryan at 8 years old running through our backyard with a fishing pole twice his size. Ryan at 12 crying after breaking his arm during Little League practice while I sat beside his hospital bed all night. Ryan at 21 hugging me after college graduation and promising, "I will always take care of you, Mom." Somewhere along the way, that boy had disappeared. By the time I reached my neighborhood, it was almost 10 o'clock. My house sat dark and silent beneath the maple trees lining the street. Charles and I bought that house 37 years ago when Ryan was still in elementary school. Back then, the neighborhood felt alive with bicycles, cookouts, and children shouting across front lawns. Now, most nights it felt quiet enough to hear your own loneliness breathing beside you. Inside, the house smelled faintly like lavender furniture polish and old books. I slipped off my wet shoes near the front door and carefully hung my coat beside Charles's old rain jacket that still remained exactly where he left it before his heart attack 3 years earlier. Some habits survive grief because changing them feels too final. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, though my appetite had completely disappeared. The digital clock above the microwave glowed 10:14 in pale green numbers. Everything around me felt painfully still. Then my phone buzzed on the counter. For one foolish second, I hoped it was Ryan calling to apologize. Instead, it was an automated fraud alert from my bank. Unusual activity detected on your account ending in 4421. Please review recent charges. I frowned immediately. Charles used to handle most of our finances before he passed away, but I had become careful over the last few years. Careful with spending. Careful with every utility bill and grocery receipt. I opened the banking application slowly and stared at the screen. Several charges appeared from places I had never visited. A luxury spa in Manhattan. Designer clothing stores in Boston. A jewelry boutique in Greenwich. Thousands of dollars over the last 4 months alone. My stomach tightened painfully. At first I thought it had to be fraud. Some stranger stealing information online. But then I noticed the purchases were all made using the secondary family card attached to my account. The card Ryan once asked me to keep open for emergencies. I sank slowly into one of the kitchen chairs while rain tapped softly against the windows above the sink. Suddenly, Vanessa's expensive dress at the restaurant looked different in my memory. So did the diamond bracelet she wore last Christmas. My eyes drifted toward the framed family photo sitting near the coffee maker. Charles stood in the middle smiling proudly while Ryan and Vanessa stood beside him during happier years. Back when I still believed love automatically created loyalty. My phone buzzed again. This time it was not the bank. It was a message from a name I had not seen in months. Harold Bennett, Charles's attorney. The text was short. Mrs. Whitmore, I believe there are several things your husband wanted you to know. I think we should meet tomorrow morning. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the restaurant again. The broken plate. Vanessa's face twisted with irritation. Ryan staring at the table instead of at his own mother. Around 3 in the morning, I finally gave up pretending rest would come and walked downstairs wrapped in my old cream-colored robe. The house creaked softly beneath my feet the way old houses do when they know your secrets. I made chamomile tea and sat alone at the kitchen table while darkness pressed against the windows outside. The fraud alert still glowed on my phone screen beside me. I opened the bank records again, slower this time. The charges stretched back farther than I first realized. $400 at a luxury salon in Manhattan. $1,200 at a jewelry boutique. $800 for a weekend spa package in Vermont. Thousands of dollars disappearing quietly month after month, while I spent winter evenings lowering my thermostat to save on heating bills. I stared at the numbers until they blurred together. The humiliation at the restaurant suddenly felt connected to something much larger. Not anger. Not resentment. Entitlement. Vanessa no longer treated me like family because she no longer believed I mattered outside of what I could provide. And Ryan had allowed it to happen one silent compromise at a time. By sunrise, the rain had stopped. Pale morning light spilled across the kitchen floor while the coffee maker hummed softly beside me. I dressed carefully before leaving for my meeting with Harold Bennett. Navy wool coat, pearl earrings, light makeup to hide the exhaustion beneath my eyes. There was something strangely important about appearing composed, as if dignity itself had become the final thing I still owned completely. Harold's office sat in an old brick building near downtown Hartford, across from a courthouse with wide stone steps and bronze doors polished by decades of use. Charles trusted Harold for almost 30 years. They played golf together every summer until Charles's health declined. Walking into that office again without my husband beside me felt painfully unnatural. Harold greeted me warmly the moment his secretary showed me inside. He looked older than I remembered, more gray around the temples, his tie slightly crooked the way it always was. "Eleanor," he said gently, standing to shake my hand. "I wish we were meeting under better circumstances." I managed a tired smile and sat across from him while he closed the office door. Quietly behind us, the room smelled faintly like coffee, paper, and old leather books. Charles always loved that smell. "I received a fraud alert from my bank last night," I said carefully. "Ryan and Vanessa have been using the secondary account card." Harold's expression darkened, though he did not seem surprised. That unsettled me immediately. He folded his hands together on the desk and took a slow breath before speaking. Before Charles passed away, he made several adjustments to the family trust. My stomach tightened. "What kind of adjustments?" Harold opened a thick folder near his elbow. Inside were pages covered in legal notes and Charles's familiar signature. Seeing my husband's handwriting again after all this time made my chest ache unexpectedly. "Your husband became concerned during the last year of his illness," Harold said quietly. "Concerned about certain behavioral patterns involving Ryan and Vanessa." I stared at him in confusion. Charles never mentioned any of this to me. If anything, he spent his final months trying to keep peace inside the family. He noticed financial requests becoming more frequent, Harold continued. Pressure regarding property ownership. Discussions about transferring assets earlier than originally planned. My mouth went dry. I remembered those conversations now. Vanessa suggesting the house was too large for me after Charles died. Ryan casually mentioning retirement communities over dinner. At the time, I told myself they were worried about my future. Now those memories look different. Sharper somehow. Charles added a protection clause to the trust, Harold explained. The inheritance designated for Ryan is conditional. I blinked slowly. Conditional on what? Harold slid one document carefully across the desk toward me. On your continued well-being and financial security. If there is evidence of neglect, coercion, emotional abuse, or financial exploitation, Ryan forfeits the majority of his inheritance rights. The room became completely silent except for the ticking wall clock behind me. For several moments I could not speak at all. I simply stared at the document while memories rearranged themselves painfully. Inside my mind, Vanessa mocking my stories, Ryan avoiding my calls, the restaurant, the bank charges. Harold's voice softened. Charles worried you would dismiss the signs because you loved your son too much. I looked down at my hands resting in my lap. Thin skin. Wedding ring still in place after 3 years alone. He was probably right, I whispered. Harold hesitated before reaching for another file. There is one more thing you should see. He opened a folder containing printed financial statements tied to the secondary card account. At the top of several purchase records was Vanessa's signature, clear as daylight. My eyes slowly moved over the pages while something cold settled deep inside my chest. Not grief this time. Not humiliation either. Clarity. The kind that arrives quietly after years of pretending not to notice what has been standing directly in front of you all along. When I returned home from Harold's office that afternoon, the house no longer felt comforting. It felt revealing. Like every room had quietly witnessed things I refused to see for years. I placed my purse carefully on the kitchen counter and stood there listening to the silence settle around me again. The refrigerator hummed softly. A clock ticked somewhere in the hallway. Outside, autumn wind stirred the maple branches against the windows. Ordinary sounds. Yet everything inside me felt altered now. I slowly walked into the living room, where Charles's favorite leather chair still sat near the fireplace exactly as he left it. Even after 3 years, I could still picture him there with reading glasses low on his nose and a newspaper folded across his lap. Charles had always noticed things before I did. Small things. Quiet things. The kind most people overlook until it is too late. I sat down carefully on the sofa and stared at the framed family photos lining the mantel. There was Ryan at 10 years old holding his first trout beside Charles at Lake Winthrop. Ryan at his college graduation with his arm wrapped proudly around me. Ryan dancing with Vanessa at their wedding while I stood nearby, smiling like the happiest mother alive. Back then, I truly believed Vanessa loved our family. She was beautiful, polished, charming with strangers. The kind of woman who remembered birthdays and brought expensive candles as hostess gifts. But even during the early years, there were moments I quietly explained away because I wanted peace more than truth. I remembered the first Thanksgiving after Ryan married her. I spent nearly 12 hours cooking for 20 people while Vanessa arrived carrying only a store-bought pie and complaints about traffic. During dinner, Charles complimented my homemade stuffing the way he always did. Vanessa smiled sweetly before saying, "Some people have more time for domestic hobbies than others." Everyone laughed lightly, including me. But later that night, Charles stood beside the sink drying dishes and quietly asked, "Did that comment bother you?" I told him no. I told him I was probably imagining things. Charles only nodded slowly, though now I realize he did not believe me. Over the years, the little moments multiplied quietly like cracks beneath wallpaper. Vanessa correcting me in front of guests whenever I told family stories. Ryan canceling Sunday visits because Vanessa felt emotionally drained. Invitations arriving later and later until eventually they stopped arriving altogether unless Sophie insisted. Each incident seemed too small to confront on its own. That was the genius of it. Nothing obvious enough to call cruelty. Just enough distance to slowly erase me without anyone having to admit it out loud. I walked upstairs to my bedroom and opened the top drawer of my dresser where I kept Charles's old letters tied neatly with a blue ribbon. Most were simple notes from our younger years. Grocery reminders, anniversary cards, small apologies after arguments that no longer mattered. But near the bottom of the stack, I found a folded piece of paper written during the final months of his illness. My hands trembled slightly before opening it. "Eleanor, if you are reading this, then I was probably right to worry. You always see the best in people, even when they no longer deserve it. Please remember something for me. Loving someone does not mean allowing them to diminish you." I stared at those words for a very long time. The afternoon sunlight shifted slowly across the bedroom carpet, while memories kept surfacing one after another. Vanessa insisting the house should eventually belong to the younger generation. Ryan asking detailed questions about Charles's life insurance only weeks after the funeral. The way Vanessa once laughed after calling me fragile in front of her friends while I stood right there pretending not to feel embarrassed. Suddenly, the restaurant no longer seemed like a shocking explosion. It felt like the final stage of something that had been building quietly for years. My phone buzzed softly on the nightstand, pulling me from my thoughts. A text from Ryan appeared across the screen. Sorry things got emotional last night. Vanessa has been under a lot of stress lately. Maybe we should all take some space for now. I read the message twice. Not one word asking if I was all right. Not one apology for what happened. Just another excuse carefully wrapped around Vanessa's behavior, like ribbon around a gift nobody wanted to open. I set the phone face down without replying. Then I noticed something else beside the lamp on my nightstand. A framed photograph from 5 years earlier. Sophie at 11 years old sitting beside me on the front porch swing eating peach ice cream during summer vacation. Her smile wide and genuine before she learned how tense adults could become around money and inheritance and control. My chest tightened unexpectedly. Sophie had looked ashamed at the restaurant. Not cruel, not indifferent. Ashamed. And for the first time since that awful dinner, I began wondering whether somebody else inside that family had started seeing the truth too. The following week, I stopped calling Ryan. I stopped sending cheerful little messages asking about Sophie's school activities or reminding him to wear a heavier coat now that Connecticut mornings were turning colder. For the first time in years, I let silence settle naturally between us instead of exhausting myself trying to repair it. The strange thing about silence is that it reveals who was carrying the relationship all along. 3 days passed before Ryan finally texted me again. Hope you are feeling better. Vanessa thinks maybe dinner got blown out of proportion. I stared at the message while standing in line at the grocery store holding a carton of eggs and a loaf of wheat bread. Blown out of proportion. Like humiliation was a scheduling inconvenience. Like a 70-year-old woman being publicly degraded in a crowded restaurant was simply an unfortunate misunderstanding everyone should politely move past. I slipped my phone back into my purse without responding. That afternoon, I met Harold again at his office. He had spent the last few days reviewing additional financial records tied to the secondary card account. The numbers were worse than I expected. More jewelry purchases, private spa reservations, expensive furniture deliveries sent directly to Ryan's address. Tens of thousands of dollars quietly disappearing while I clipped grocery coupons and delayed replacing my leaking water heater because I thought retirement required sacrifice. Harold adjusted his glasses while flipping through the statements. Legally speaking, he said carefully, you have more protection than you realize. I looked down at the papers spread across the desk. Proof, dates, signatures. It all felt strangely unreal. I do not want revenge, I said quietly. Harold studied me for a moment before replying. No, but I think you finally want the truth. His words followed me long after I left the office. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table organizing old receipts and bank records into neat folders. Outside, orange leaves drifted across the driveway beneath the porch light. The house felt calmer lately. Not happier exactly, just clearer. Around 7 o'clock, my phone buzzed unexpectedly. Sophie. For a second, I hesitated before answering. Hi, sweetheart, I said gently. Her voice sounded nervous. Grandma, are you home? I am. A brief pause followed. Can I come over for a little while? 20 minutes later, Sophie stood on my front porch wearing an oversized gray sweatshirt and holding a small paper bag from the bakery near her school. Her blonde hair was tied back carelessly, and her eyes looked older somehow than they had just weeks earlier. I brought cinnamon rolls, she said softly while stepping inside. The ones you like. My throat tightened unexpectedly. That was thoughtful of you. We sat together at the kitchen table while steam curled from 2 mugs of tea between us. For several minutes, Sophie only stared quietly at the countertop while twisting the sleeve of her sweatshirt around her fingers. Finally, she looked up. I am really sorry about the restaurant. I forced a small smile. None of that was your fault. But I saw it coming, she whispered. Mama's been angry at you for months. The sadness in her voice hurt almost more than the confession itself. I stayed quiet, allowing her space to continue. She says you make Dad feel guilty all the time, Sophie admitted. And she jokes that you act helpless so people will take care of you. I felt something cold settle behind my ribs again. Not shock anymore. Confirmation. Sophie swallowed hard before adding quietly. Sometimes she calls you the family burden when her friends are around. The kitchen suddenly felt very still. The old wall clock ticked softly beside the refrigerator while Sophie stared down at her untouched tea. Did your father ever say those things? I asked carefully. Sophie shook her head immediately. No, Dad mostly just stays quiet. Of course he did. Silence had become Ryan's favorite form of loyalty. Sophie reached into her backpack slowly and pulled out her phone. "There is something else," she said nervously. Then she placed the phone in front of me and pressed play on a video clip. The screen showed Bellamy's restaurant from the night of the birthday dinner. Someone seated nearby had recorded part of the scene after the plate crashed onto the floor. I watched myself standing there frozen beneath the restaurant lights while strangers stared openly from nearby tables. Vanessa's voice rang clearly through the speakers. "She always ruins everything." Then Ryan's voice followed quietly, but unmistakably. "Just ignore her. She will leave eventually." My chest tightened so sharply I had to set the phone down. Sophie looked near tears now. "I did not know they sounded that bad until I watched it again," she whispered. For a long moment, I could not speak at all. I simply stared at the dark phone screen reflecting my own tired face back at me. Then slowly, very slowly, I understood something important. The cruelest part of betrayal is not the moment people hurt you. It is realizing they became comfortable doing it long before you finally allowed yourself to see it. After Sophie left that night, I sat alone in the kitchen long after the tea had gone cold. Her words lingered inside the house like smoke that refused to disappear. Family burden. She will leave eventually. I kept hearing Ryan's voice from the video over and over again, calm and detached, as though he were discussing bad weather instead of his own mother. For years I convinced myself his silence meant discomfort, that deep down he still cared but did not know how to stand up to Vanessa. Now I understood something painful. Silence repeated long enough becomes agreement. I turned off the kitchen light and walked slowly through the dark house toward my bedroom. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet the same way they always had. Familiar sounds, familiar walls. Yet I no longer moved through the house like a woman waiting for her family to love her again. Something inside me had shifted quietly over the last few days. Not rage, not bitterness, awareness. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. Pale sunlight filtered through the curtains while cold October rain tapped softly against the windows. I made coffee, toasted 2 slices of wheat bread, and sat at the dining room table with the folders Harold helped me organize. Bank records, transaction histories, screenshots, copies of trust documents. Evidence stacked neatly in front of me while steam curled from my coffee mug. Looking at those papers no longer made me cry. Instead, they made me strangely calm. Around 10 o'clock, my phone rang unexpectedly. Ryan. I let it ring twice before answering. "Hi, Mom." His voice sounded cautious, almost rehearsed. "Hello, Ryan." A brief silence followed. "Vanessa thinks things have been tense lately," he said carefully. "We were hoping maybe everyone could move past what happened." I stared out the dining room window toward the wet backyard while leaves blew across the patio stones. "Move past it." The same phrase people use when they want forgiveness without accountability. "Your wife humiliated me in public," I replied quietly. Ryan exhaled heavily like I was making things difficult. "Mom, you know Vanessa gets emotional sometimes." Emotional. Such a convenient word. Softer than cruel. Kinder than calculated. "And what about you?" I asked. "What exactly did you feel while your wife insulted your mother in front of strangers?" Ryan went silent immediately. For several seconds, all I could hear was faint traffic noise through his phone speaker. "I do not want another fight," he finally muttered. "Neither do I answered calmly. "That is why I stopped chasing one." Before he could respond, I ended the call gently and placed the phone back on the table. My hands did not shake this time. That surprised me most of all. Later that afternoon, Harold arrived at the house carrying another folder beneath his arm. I invited him into the living room where rainlight softened the old hardwood floors and photographs lined the fireplace mantel. He removed his coat carefully before sitting across from me. "There is something important you should understand," he said. "Charles did not only create protections inside the trust. He also documented concerns privately over the last year of his life." Harold handed me a thin leather notebook worn slightly at the edges. I recognized it instantly. Charles's handwriting covered the pages in neat blue ink. My chest tightened painfully while I opened it. Most entries were simple observations at first. Vanessa pressuring Ryan about selling the house. Arguments over family money. Concerns about me being isolated after his death. Then the entries became more direct. Eleanor keeps defending them even when they hurt her. I worry she does not see how much Ryan has changed. Another entry stopped me completely. If something happens to me, Harold must make sure Eleanor knows she was never weak. Only too forgiving. Tears finally blurred my vision for the first time since the restaurant. Not dramatic sobbing, just quiet tears slipping down my face while the room remained completely still around me. Harold gave me time before speaking again. Charles loved your son deeply, he said softly. But near the end, he realized love alone does not fix character. I closed the notebook carefully and pressed my palm against the worn leather cover. Somewhere upstairs, the old heating vents clicked softly as warm air moved through the house. Outside, rain continued falling steadily across the neighborhood. What happens now? I asked after a long silence. Harold looked at me steadily. That depends entirely on what kind of future you want for yourself. I thought about Sophie sitting nervously at my kitchen table, about the humiliation at Bellamy's, about years spent shrinking myself to keep peace inside a family that no longer respected me. Then I looked around the room Charles and I built together over nearly 4 decades. Every photograph, every piece of furniture, every memory earned honestly through sacrifice and love. For the first time in years, I no longer felt afraid of losing my family. Because deep down, I finally understood something heartbreaking. You cannot lose people who already decided to leave you emotionally long ago. 2 weeks passed quietly after my meeting with Harold. Outside, autumn settled deeper across Connecticut. The trees lining my street turned shades of copper and gold while cold winds carried leaves across empty sidewalks every morning. Inside the house, life became strangely peaceful for the first time in years. I stopped waiting for Ryan to call. I stopped rehearsing imaginary conversations where he suddenly understood how much he had hurt me. Instead, I focused on practical things. Organizing paperwork, meeting with Harold, taking long walks through the neighborhood before sunset, while the air smelled like fireplaces and rain. The silence no longer felt lonely. It felt honest. One Thursday afternoon, Sophie came by after school carrying 2 paper cups of hot chocolate from the cafe near campus. She curled up beside me on the living room sofa while rain tapped gently against the windows. Mom is planning some huge anniversary party next weekend, she said quietly. I looked up from the book resting in my lap. Anniversary party? Sophie nodded. 20 years for her and Dad. Something about her tone made me pay closer attention. She keeps talking about making some big family announcement. My stomach tightened slightly, though my face remained calm. What kind of announcement? Sophie hesitated before answering. I overheard her telling Dad this is finally their chance to start taking control of everything. Everything. Such a small word for something so ugly underneath. I closed the book carefully and rested it beside me. Did your father say anything? Sophie gave a sad little shrug. Mostly he just agreed with her. Of course he did. Later that evening, after Sophie left, I sat alone in Charles's old chair thinking about the party. Vanessa loved appearances. Elegant wine glasses, catered dinners, carefully staged happiness displayed like furniture in a showroom. The restaurant incident embarrassed her because strangers witnessed it. Public image mattered deeply to people like Vanessa. That was why Harold's next phone call felt almost inevitable. I received an interesting email this morning, he told me calmly over the phone. From Vanessa. I frowned slightly. What does she want? An invitation. Harold paused. Apparently, they would like me present at the anniversary event because Ryan plans to discuss future estate management responsibilities publicly. I stared silently through the dining room window toward the dark backyard. Future estate management. They really believe the future already belonged to them. Do they know about the trust conditions? I asked quietly. No, Harold answered. And they clearly assume you have not spoken with me. A long silence followed between us before he added carefully. Eleanor, I think they are preparing to formalize financial control over your assets socially before addressing it legally. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. My humiliation at Bellamy's suddenly made even more sense now. Vanessa had already stopped pretending I deserved respect because she assumed ownership was only a matter of time. What do you want to do? Harold asked gently. I looked around the room slowly. At Charles's photographs. At the old piano in the corner. At the life we spent decades building together piece by piece. Then I remembered Vanessa calling me a burden while wearing jewelry purchased with money quietly drained from my account. I said softly, I would like to attend the party. Saturday evening arrived cold and windy. The event was held at an upscale country club overlooking a lake about 30 minutes outside Hartford. Warm golden lights glowed through tall windows while luxury cars filled the parking lot outside. I stood for a moment beneath the entrance awning, smoothing the sleeves of my dark navy dress before walking inside. I could already hear soft jazz music drifting through the ballroom. Vanessa always did enjoy dramatic entrances. The room looked exactly as I expected. White floral arrangements, crystal chandeliers, champagne glasses balanced on silver trays. Wealth displayed carefully enough to look tasteful rather than desperate. Ryan stood near the bar wearing an expensive charcoal suit, while Vanessa moved gracefully through clusters of guests like a politician greeting donors. The moment she spotted me near the entrance, surprise flashed visibly across her face before disappearing behind a polished smile. "Eleanor," she said sweetly while approaching me. "I was not sure you would come." I returned her smile calmly. Family occasions still matter to me. Her eyes narrowed slightly, almost imperceptibly. Ryan walked over a few seconds later, looking uncomfortable already. "Mom," he said cautiously, "you look nice tonight." Nice. Not beautiful. Not elegant. Just nice. The language people use when guilt makes warmth difficult. I nodded politely and accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter. Around us, guests laughed softly while waitstaff carried trays of expensive appetizers through the ballroom. Everything looked perfect on the surface. That was the danger of polished families. Outsiders rarely notice the rot underneath until something finally collapses publicly. About an hour into the evening, Vanessa tapped gently against her champagne glass for attention. Conversations slowly quieted across the ballroom while she stepped beside Ryan near the center stage area decorated with silver candles and white roses. Her smile gleamed beneath the chandelier lights. "Tonight is not only about celebrating 20 wonderful years together," she announced smoothly. "It is also about looking toward the future of our family." My fingers tightened slightly around my glass. Across the room, Harold Bennett quietly entered through the ballroom doors carrying a thin black leather briefcase in one hand. The moment Harold Bennett entered the ballroom, I saw confusion flicker across Ryan's face. Vanessa noticed it too. Her polished smile tightened almost invisibly before she recovered and continued speaking into the microphone. "Family means everything to us," she announced warmly while resting one manicured hand against Ryan's arm. "And as we move into the next chapter of our lives, Ryan and I are excited to take on greater responsibilities for the Whitmore family legacy." Several guests applauded politely. Crystal glasses clinked softly around the room, while waiters continued weaving through the crowd, carrying trays of champagne. Vanessa looked radiant beneath the chandelier lights. Confident. Victorious. She truly believed the evening belonged to her. Harold crossed the ballroom slowly until he reached my table near the back windows overlooking the lake. He greeted me with a quiet nod before placing his leather briefcase carefully beside his chair. Across the room, Ryan kept glancing nervously in our direction now. Vanessa noticed his distraction and lightly squeezed his wrist without losing her smile. "My mother-in-law Eleanor has always believed family wealth should support future generations," Vanessa continued smoothly. "And we are honored she trusts us to help guide those responsibilities moving forward." Trust us. The irony almost made me laugh. I sat quietly with my hands folded in my lap while guests smiled approvingly at Vanessa's performance. To them, she looked graceful and devoted. That was always her greatest talent. She understood appearances better than honesty. Then Harold stood up. The movement was small, but it changed the energy in the room immediately. Vanessa's smile faltered for half a second. "Actually," Harold said calmly, "there are several legal clarifications regarding the Whitmore estate that should probably be addressed before any public assumptions are made." Silence spread slowly through the ballroom. Ryan's face lost color almost instantly. Vanessa recovered faster. "Harold," she said lightly with a strained laugh, "tonight is really just a family celebration." "Exactly," Harold replied evenly, "which makes transparency especially important." Every eye in the room shifted toward our table now. I remained seated quietly while Harold opened his briefcase and removed a thin folder. The soft sound of paper sliding across leather somehow seemed louder than the music still playing faintly overhead. Before his passing, Harold continued, "Charles Whitmore revised the family trust extensively." Ryan stared at him openly now. "What are you talking about?" he asked. Harold looked directly at him. "Your father created conditional inheritance protections tied specifically to Eleanor Whitmore's emotional and financial well-being." A murmur spread through the nearby guests. Vanessa's expression hardened instantly beneath her polished composure. I think this is inappropriate, she snapped quietly. Harold ignored her. The trust includes provisions regarding abandonment, coercion, public humiliation, and financial exploitation. Ryan looked completely stunned now. That is ridiculous, Vanessa interrupted sharply. Nobody exploited anyone. Harold calmly removed another document from the folder. Over the last 4 months alone, more than $42,000 were charged to Eleanor Whitmore's secondary family account without her informed consent. The room became painfully still. I watched Vanessa's face carefully. For the first time since I met her, she looked genuinely frightened. Those expenses were family-related, she said quickly. Ryan had access to the account. Access is not ownership, Harold replied calmly. Then he placed several printed statements onto the table in front of nearby guests. Jewelry purchases, spa retreats, luxury furnishings. Every signature belonged to Vanessa. Ryan turned toward his wife slowly. You said Mom approved those charges. Vanessa's eyes widened briefly before anger replaced panic. Do not do this to me right now, she hissed under her breath. Harold spoke again before the argument could grow louder. There is also documented evidence of repeated emotional mistreatment. Sophie stood frozen near the ballroom entrance, clutching her phone tightly against her chest. She looked pale but determined. Vanessa followed Harold's gaze toward her daughter and suddenly understood. Sophie, she whispered sharply. Sophie did not move. Harold's voice remained calm and steady. Based on the trust conditions established by Charles Whitmore, the combination of financial misuse and documented public humiliation triggers automatic revocation clauses regarding primary inheritance control. Ryan looked like somebody had removed the floor beneath him. What does that mean? He asked weakly. Harold closed the folder carefully before answering. It means you no longer inherit executive control over the Whitmore estate. The silence afterward felt enormous. Around us, wealthy strangers stared awkwardly into champagne glasses while pretending not to listen. Vanessa's face flushed deep red beneath the ballroom lights. This is insane, she snapped. She manipulated all of this because she cannot stand losing control. For the first time that evening, I finally stood up slowly from my chair. Every movement felt calm, measured. I looked directly at Vanessa while the ballroom remained completely silent around us. No, I said quietly. I simply stopped pretending your cruelty was normal. Vanessa opened her mouth again, but no words came out this time. Ryan stared at me with an expression I had not seen in years. Not irritation, not pity, fear, real fear. I picked up my coat carefully from the back of my chair and turned toward the ballroom doors. Then, just before leaving, I looked once more at my son standing beneath the expensive chandeliers beside the woman he chose over his own conscience. You confused kindness with weakness, I said softly. That was your mistake, not mine. The morning after the anniversary party, the world looked strangely ordinary. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen curtains. The coffee maker hummed softly beside me. Across the street, my neighbor Greg carried his newspaper up the driveway wearing the same red flannel jacket he had owned for years. Nothing outside my house suggested an entire chapter of my life had ended the night before. And yet everything inside me felt different. Lighter somehow. Not happy exactly. Grief does not disappear just because truth finally arrives. But for the first time in years, I no longer felt trapped inside someone else's version of reality. My phone rang 3 times before noon. Ryan. Then Vanessa. Then Ryan again. I let every call go to voicemail. Their messages shifted quickly from confusion to anger to desperation. Mom, please call me back. There has been a misunderstanding. You embarrassed us in front of everyone. That last message almost made me smile. Embarrassed us. As though public humiliation had suddenly become unacceptable now that it belonged to them instead of me. By late afternoon, Sophie arrived carrying a small pumpkin pie from the bakery downtown. She stood awkwardly in the doorway for a moment before asking quietly, "Are you okay?" I looked at her carefully, at the nervousness in her eyes, at the sadness she tried so hard to hide beneath politeness. Then I opened my arms and hugged her tightly for the first time in months. "I think I finally will be," I whispered. We spent the evening together in the kitchen drinking tea while rain drifted softly against the windows. Sophie told me she planned to apply to colleges outside Connecticut next year. "I need distance from all of this," she admitted quietly. I understood exactly what she meant. Toxic families have a way of shrinking the air around you until breathing itself feels difficult. 2 weeks later, Harold and I finalized the revised structure of the Whitmore estate. Most of the assets would be transferred into a charitable trust supporting housing assistance and educational grants for women over 60 who had experienced financial abandonment later in life. Charles spent his entire career building stability for our family. It felt right that part of his legacy would now protect women who understood what it meant to become invisible inside their own homes. Harold smiled softly after I signed the final document. Charles would have been proud of you, he said. I looked down at the papers quietly. I spent too many years trying to keep peace by accepting disrespect, I replied. I do not think he ever wanted that for me. Ryan came to the house once after the trust was finalized. I saw his car pull into the driveway just before sunset one cold November evening. He stood on the porch looking older than I remembered. Tired. Smaller somehow beneath the weight of consequences he never expected to face. When I opened the door, neither of us spoke immediately. The porch light cast pale gold across fallen leaves gathered near the steps. Finally, Ryan cleared his throat awkwardly. Mom, I made mistakes. I waited quietly. Vanessa and I are separating for a while, he admitted. Things have been bad. There was a time when hearing those words would have shattered me. But standing there now, I mostly felt sad for the boy he used to be and the man he allowed himself to become. I never wanted money to matter more than family, he said softly. I looked at him for a long moment before answering. Money was never the real problem, Ryan. His eyes lowered immediately because deep down he already understood. Respect, loyalty, character. Those were the things he traded away piece by piece long before any inheritance disappeared. He tried apologizing again before leaving, but the words sounded fragile and unfinished between us. Some damage cannot be repaired simply because guilt finally arrives late to the conversation. Winter settled over Connecticut soon afterward. The maple trees outside my house stood bare against gray skies while frost gathered along the edges of the windows each morning. Life became quieter, simpler. Sophie visited often during school breaks. Harold occasionally joined me for coffee downtown. And for the first time in years, I began making decisions based on peace instead of fear of disappointing other people. One snowy afternoon in early December, I sat alone inside a small cafe near the town square watching strangers hurry past the windows wrapped in scarves and heavy coats. A cinnamon candle flickered softly near the register while old jazz music played overhead. I wrapped both hands around a warm mug of coffee and looked out at the snow falling gently across the sidewalks. 3 months earlier, I would have called myself lonely sitting there alone. Now the silence felt different. Not empty, earned. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang softly through the cold afternoon air. I thought about Charles, about the life we built together, about the woman I used to be before years of quiet humiliation taught me to shrink myself for the comfort of others. Then I looked at my reflection faintly mirrored in the cafe window. Older now, wiser too, still standing. They thought humiliating me would make me disappear. Instead, it reminded me exactly who I was.